or a form of genetic memory. I found too many coincidences to brush off with any nihilism. I discovered that John had enlisted into the Union Army, likely to gain social approval to court his future wife, Barbary Ann Schaffer 1838-1911. Hi. So, my paranormal experience is partly rooted in an open mind towards reincarnation, and specifically the concept of ancestral return, ascent, or genetic memory. Concepts that can be Googled for further explanation, but suffice to say, I recently discovered a possible past life or some kind of spiritual connection, and it is probably the least desirable past life to imagine. But before I explain, I have to summarize how I discovered it. I'm an adult male 40 years old and recently had a relationship that ended with all of the normal feelings. Involved disappointment, sadness, regret, and anger. No spiritual things to see on the surface level, but those emotions triggered something that caused me to look closely. I began to think about a very specific person in my family tree, someone who I had but skeletal knowledge of, a few census returns, and indices about his military service with few details. I knew he lived in Baltimore County, Maryland at the time of the American Civil War, and that he served in the 7th Maryland Volunteers US. I knew little else about what his life was actually like, or what his wartime experiences were. I live in Maryland as well, but in a different county. All of my grandparents and great-grandparents lived in or near Baltimore, and not the part of Maryland that I personally grew up in. Anyway, when this relationship ended, this particular relative came to mind very strongly. It would be as if you woke up in the morning and you felt like you needed to call someone urgently. Almost. It was intense, and I thought, perhaps I am just wanting to distract myself from the melancholy. No harm in that, nothing to see here. I felt like my emotions had something to do with why this specific relative was coming to mind. Ugh, it was too piercing, and felt relevant in some mysterious way. I began to research my relative, John Thomas Kelba 1840-1907. I have a certificate in genealogical research from Boston University and a master's in library science plus 8 years of professional genealogy and working as an archivist, so my historical research is as objective as it gets. I do not project emotions on the historical evidence, but what I discovered mirrored the emotions I was experiencing. I began to consider whether this was a psychic connection, a possible past life, or a form of genetic memory. I found too many coincidences to brush off with any nihilism. I discovered that John had enlisted into the Union Army, likely to gain social approval to court his future wife, Barbary Ann Schaffer 1838-1911. She had been the mark of shame in her family, having a child born out of wedlock by another man, who ultimately did not marry her to make her respectable. That her father, William, was deeply protective of her and scorned interlopers. He was also a staunch Unionist, believing the Southern Rebellion had to be put down by force. As the Civil War raged, John often worked on his uncle's farm in Carroll County, Maryland. His uncle was as a neighbor of William Schaffer, and John did some work at the Schaffer farm in his civilian trade as a stonemason. John joined the army in August of 1862, marching out to the front shortly after the Battle of Antietam. He even got himself promoted to corporal, probably for being fifth in line at the recruitment office in Baltimore. He enlisted in Company D, 7th ND Volunteers, along with other neighbors and kinfolk. After 6 months of service, though John's ulterior motives for enlisting gave way to the decision to desert from the army, he had witnessed at least one terrifying skirmish in September of 1862 as the Confederate Army retreated after the Battle of Antietam. When it became cold, and particularly with the coming Christmas holiday, John deserted with a group of 3 other homesick soldiers. They managed to travel the 70 or so miles from the front to their homes further east. To avoid detection, John shacked up at his uncle's farm so as to avoid inquiring authorities, and conveniently close to his love interest. When some time had passed, John reconnected with Barbara and presented himself as if his enlistment had expired. In truth, though, John was AWOL and eventually declared a deserter. By March of 1863, John and Barbara married on July 19, 1863. John was by this time helping William Schaffer and looking to work for an interest in the farm in exchange for his labor. The war seemed distant in this rural area, but his name was being circulated in descriptive lists of deserters, and others, possibly the other male involved with Barbara, informed against John to the local authorities. In April of 1864, John was arrested and eventually court-martialed. He was sentenced to 1 year of imprisonment at Fort Delaware and forced to wear a ball and chain as part of the sentence. Most unhappily, his prison sentence began on his first wedding anniversary, July 19, 1864. I know then that the feeling of dejection, loss, anger, everything I was feeling were one and the same as the emotions he felt. Then, and I made the discovery on the 160th anniversary of his imprisonment, a significant milestone for many of the battle anniversaries, as much as for my own family history. What were the odds I could discover that in such a poignant way? The kicker is that John is buried in a cemetery that is about a mile from my childhood home. My family had no idea that we had connections to Carroll County that far back. We saw ourselves as city folk. None of my oldest living relatives had any knowledge of these relatives. It was just long enough ago to not be in their living memories. But as a child, I was drawn to that cemetery and would ride my bike to visit. As a kind of adventure, there was a Revolutionary War soldier, Captain John Murray SR, whose grave was marked with a historical marker. And when I was 9 or 10, I would visit that headstone to see it. It turned out that Murray was a neighbor of my fourth great-grandfather, Henry Kelba, their names appearing in close proximity on the same page of the 1820 census. Anyway, John did survive the war and was married to Barbara happily after the war, but his experience of imprisonment and bearing the faults of his naivete suffered in emotional ways that struck a chord with me. I don't know if I was him, but I do feel like I knew the story before I knew the details. I don't know exactly how this lined up, but I do feel like I was led to this discovery. Thanks for reading.